these slides. Basically, what I'm going to do today is share some stories with you all from the last 12 months of fieldwork that I've been conducting in the cities of London, Leicester and Norwich, as you've just heard. I can start without the slides. Essentially, what I've been doing is collecting life histories. The life histories of many different British Muslims, roughly aged around 21 and up, who have spent the majority of their lives in this country either living here or working here, strongly identifying themselves with this land as opposed to Paris. And essentially we've conducted interviews of around an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, where they just get to explore not only their own life histories, but their opinions on Britain, Britishness, and feelings for the future. So that's why I've titled it A Tale of Three Cities. For anyone who is methodologically inclined, this is how I did it. Mixed methods, so semi-structured interviewing, life histories, a bit of participation and some observation. A little bit about my cities. I chose London because it being home to 1 million Muslims, it's obvious, and a city with a very unique history. It's had a very long relationship with Islam, and Muslims, stretching back to Ottoman times, even before the colonial era, as you would have heard in some of the earlier panels. From hosting Muslim ambassadors to housing Indian nannies and brushing past abandoned sailors on the streets, being the metropolis that it is, several communities, as you'll all know by now, have passed through, interacted with London, be it for a short period of time, or making her a permanent home. Outside of London, Leicester has one of the most diverse populations of ethnic minorities. I think according to the 2011 census, it's home to around 60,000 Muslims-ish, and it is the 11th largest community of Muslims in the country. So when I was looking up official statistics and demographics for Leicester, you'll hear Indian come up a lot. A lot of ethnically Indian people, mainly Gujaratis, some Pakistanis, some Bangladeshi, Somali and Turkish folk. When I interviewed some of these so-called Indian people, they often referred to themselves as African. So a lot of people who grew up actually considering themselves British, growing up in Zimbabwe and Malawi and places like that. And as a lot of people will know, there was a big exodus of Indian Muslims from Uganda in the 70s when they were expelled by Idi Amin. In contrast, Somali and Kurdish communities are considered to be the new arrivals in Leicester, and they've been settling in the city for roughly around the last 10-15 years. Perhaps Norwich has the most unique story that's not normally heard as part of the mainstream British Muslim narrative. I'm going to set the scene very nicely. It was a community, or is a community, established by English converts in the 1970s. It was originally a community actively brought together by white English converts, black African and Caribbean communities who were residing in Brixton. They all made a conscious decision to leave their lives and set up home together in Norwich. This community that I've spent a few months with and have observed and interviewed, it's an example to me anyway so far as a blending of cultures when it comes to Islam. Originally set up by a Scottish convert who went by the name of Ian Dallas, now Sheikh Abdul Qadir, received his teachings in Morocco. The community has imbibed some elements of North African Sufi Islam with elements of general Western culture. Some obvious elements of the latter include dress, the way a lot of the women choose to wear their hijab, the regular use of English as opposed to any other language. There is some use of Arabic also. Teachings have included European philosophy in the past, as well as classical Islamic scholarship. Some of my respondents actually described Norwich as a place where you can come, quote unquote, just be Muslim, without any cultural baggage. Activities related to the Tariqa were considered voluntary by some members of the community, not all. But what the reoccurring theme was from the members of the Norwich Muslim community was that Norwich was a place where you could live a life closely in accordance with Quran and Sunnah without the sterility that comes with a life that has been deemed as Salafi or Wahhabi. One key point I forgot to mention is that it's also by far the smallest community out of the three that I spoke to. It's a community of around 200 people, and that includes children, so not actually that many adults. So what's interesting to me about Norwich is that whilst the parental generation came into Islam, describing them, a lot of the founding members of the community described themselves as New Age, 60s, post-war hippies looking for a bit more meaning in life, searching for something, weren't really sure what that was, and met Sheikh Abdul Qadir and converted to Islam. They all, a lot of them said to me that they knew nothing about Islam when they converted. There was very little knowledge. They just wanted a piece of whatever this was. And so they all actively converted together and actually learned about Islam together from scratch. But that's the parents, right? So the children, which was interesting to me, are going through being born Muslim, are going through exactly the same process as a lot of young Muslims of different ethnicities who also refer to themselves as British, going through the same processes of separating what's essential, what's obligatory, what's cultural, and negotiating their own Muslimness in an environment that they describe as hostile to spiritual growth, with aggressive secularism, perhaps bordering on atheism, according to some of my respondents, on one side, and living within the safe confines of the Islamic environment which their parents have tried so hard to create on the other side. Now, with such a broad sample across very different parts of England, it was expected that a diverse range of experiences and opinions would be captured, and this definitely happened. But there were also several commonalities. Every single one of my 50 or so respondents described experiencing some form of racism, implicit or explicit, either at the workplace, at school, on the street, or even, quite sadly, from other Muslim communities. When asked if they remembered stories in the news, bearing in mind that the average age was around 25 of my respondents, almost every single one started their memories of news events with 9/11. This was marked by many of my respondents as a turning point in Muslim and non-Muslim relations, and one sadly for the worst. However, almost every one of my respondents reported having positive feelings towards being British and Muslim, with very few reporting that it was difficult for them personally to be both. And perhaps in relation to current debates that are going on, the issue of Britishness came up repeatedly, with my respondents exploring what Britishness meant to them. So basically what I was thinking of doing here is sharing some of my respondents' views with you all. I've pulled out some responses to two of the questions that we explored, namely, what does Britishness mean to the individual, and whether spirituality in the Islamic sense, or just their faith, had consciously shaped any of their choices. If I tell you a little bit about Sajida, she lives in London, she is 33 years old, she is an activist and also works in the race relations industry. When I asked her what does it mean to be British to you, she kept it quite superficial in her own words. She was looking at conduct, mannerisms, and described being British as a people who are quite introverted and quiet. But if we jump to Rashid, a 27-year-old student, I'm not going to read the whole quote out, you can read it there. What I'm going to pick out on it is that he kept it quite simple. Being British is essentially someone who's from the Isles, who believes in the Constitution and the mandate of Parliament and the Queen. Although he also agrees that you can be an anti-monarchist if you like. The thing that struck out to me about Rashid's definition of what it meant to be British to him is that he was saying he didn't want to take it too far. And the reason why he didn't want to take this discussion too far is because he didn't believe that we had had an honest discussion about what we had collectively defined as what it meant to be British and what British values were. If we move on to Leicester, Halima was an artisan, self-employed from Leicester, and she was quite confused when we were talking about Britishness, saying, oh, I'm not very political, oh, I don't really know, but do you know what, I really love Leicester. I love Leicester, it's a melting pot, and I don't really want to be anyone else. So we left it at that there. But when we spoke to Alia, She was one of the few that actually started to talk about Christianity. That's not Alia. Hold on. Where is she? There we go, sorry. She emphasised elements of Britishness through Christian values, looking up to the Archbishop of Canterbury. She expressed her contentment in a way that there was some sort of religious authority within the House of Lords, saying that she would prefer that there was some element of religiousness within the parliamentary system that made decisions on our behalf, rather than there being any at all. What isn't written there, but what I also thought was very interesting when she was talking about being British, is that she said, well, you kind of put a label on Britishness, because it's quite hard to define, because the term itself is defined by the people who live in Britain. So I thought that was quite interesting, as the landscape is changing, that she had put her finger onto that. And I'm going to skip on to Akbar, because Akbar was the only one from Norwich who actually emphasised the role of Islam when it came to his definition of what it meant to be British and how one could be British. He argued that Islamically, in terms of identity, what mattered was where you were born, your tribe, and where you had lived for the longest. For him, that was Norwich. Despite being born to Scottish parents, having an English accent, not being English in his own words, and travelling the world and living in lots of different places, he identified the most strongly with Norwich because that's where he had lived and worked and had his family for the longest of times. For him, being British, or Britain as a whole, was just a generalisation. So if we go on to some views about how Islam shaped the lives of some of my respondents, Ahmed was a very interesting one because actually, incidentally, he was or is also a member of the Ahmadi Jamaat in London. So he had lots of interesting things to say, not only from outside of the Muslim community, but how people perceived him as a Muslim within the community. When asked how faith, or if faith, shaped his choices, he argued that it influences one's behaviour, and you get to a point where you cannot distinguish between who you are and who your faith is. He argued that it regulated thought process and regulated decision-making. When it comes to stereotypes and misconceptions and racisms, which is one other bit that we spoke about, Ahmed actually went on to say that outside of the Muslim community, people cannot differentiate between Muslims and non-Muslims, between Muslims, sorry. He argued that it was a binary approach. And the other thing that I want to highlight about what he said to me is that he actually identified other Muslim groups as a challenge for them. He argued that there was conflict because of their beliefs, because of the way they organise themselves. They have the system of caliphate, for example. And they were quite upset that other Muslim groups, in his perception, were simply unwilling to listen to a different view. Finally, talking about stereotypes, misconceptions and racisms, Sajida actually captured something that a lot of my interviewees said. I'm going to read it in full because she really did hit the point home. 50 odd people more or less said the same thing in different ways. So when asked, have you felt any misconceptions or stereotypes? Are there things that you're worried about? She said this: their perception is that they shouldn't be here. In 10 years' time, with the immigration and how difficult it's all become with racism, and I will call it racism. I'm one of the people that says racism, I call it discrimination. That's why people should have other plans. It sounds like we have a home back home and things like that. I'm not saying that we should leave this country. We have a right. That's my birthright. This is God's soil, not man's soil. This is God's soil, and I have a birthright here. I contribute to the society and I'm an equal. It was quite disturbing how many times this theme was reoccurring. So basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that identity formation in minority Muslim communities, like in a lot of different communities, is a very complex process involving the negotiation of several factors of the self all at the same time. What I'm slowly discovering as I unpack these stories is that Britain's Muslim communities are in a state of transition. Where that transition ends is currently in a state of flux. Many who agreed to be interviewed for my study actively self-identified as British Muslims. Others argued that they were just Muslim who happened to live in Britain. Religion and spirituality played a large role in the lives of my respondents, who described how their practice and their beliefs had evolved over time as they grew older and their circumstances had changed. For many, Islam was a thing that they held on to really tightly, a reassuring, constant factor in their lives which allowed them space away from the stresses of everyday life. It also gave them the means to deal with racism, discrimination, and feeling under pressure. There's a lot more to tell and a lot more to share, but in the time that I've been allowed, I've attempted to present to you some stories in an attempt to humanize the British Muslim experience, to allow others to step into the lives of strangers in an attempt to peek into a small window of experience, emotion, and confusion, as Muslims seek to negotiate a landscape which is perceived to be cold and hostile towards them. And as a final reminder, at the end of the day, as one of my respondents said, he doesn't want to be thought of as an alien and shouldn't have to. Thank you for listening.